I woke up to find my husband unconscious on the bathroom floor, blood pooling beneath his head where it had struck the porcelain edge of the tub. The metallic scent filled my nostrils as I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands shaking so violently I could barely reach for my phone. In the chaos of that moment, calling for help, screaming his name, checking for a pulse that felt thread-thin beneath my fingertips, I had no idea that the nightmare sprawling before me was only the beginning. The real horror, the one that would unravel everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, my very identity, was waiting for me in the sterile corridors of the emergency room, hidden behind a doctor's confused expression and a name I had never heard before. Before we get going, please leave a comment telling us which state or city you're watching from. And please don't forget to like and subscribe so this channel can grow and bring you more compelling stories. My name is Simone, and before that morning, I would have described my life as blessed, ordinary in the most beautiful way. I had been married to my husband DeShawn for 7 years. We had built what I thought was a solid life together in our modest 3-bedroom house in the suburbs outside Birmingham, Alabama. DeShawn worked as a senior analyst at a financial consulting firm downtown, leaving early each morning in his pressed suits, his cologne lingering in the hallway long after he'd gone. I taught 4th grade at the local elementary school, a job I loved despite the modest pay and the endless stack of papers that followed me home each evening. We didn't have children yet, though we talked about it often, always pushing the conversation to next year, when things would be more settled, when we'd saved a little more, when the timing felt right. DeShawn was everything I thought I wanted in a partner. He was attentive without being smothering, successful without being arrogant, and he had a way of making me feel seen that I'd never experienced in my previous relationships. When he proposed to me on a beach in Florida, the sunset painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I hadn't hesitated for even a second. This was the man I was meant to spend my life with. This was the future I had always dreamed of. But that morning, as I knelt on the cold bathroom tile, my pajamas soaking up his blood, I felt the first tremor of something fundamentally wrong, though I couldn't yet name it. DeShawn had been complaining of headaches for weeks, dismissing my concerns with a wave of his hand and promises that he'd make a doctor's appointment soon. He was too busy at work, he said. It was just stress. It would pass. I had believed him because I wanted to believe him, because the alternative, that something serious might be wrong, was too terrifying to contemplate. The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes, though it felt like hours. The paramedics moved with efficient urgency, asking me questions I struggled to answer through my panic. How long had he been unconscious? Had he complained of pain? Was he on any medications? I rattled off what I knew, my voice sounding distant and strange to my own ears, as if someone else was speaking through my mouth. They loaded him onto a gurcher, and I followed them to the ambulance, still in my pajamas, not even thinking to grab my purse or my phone charger or anything beyond the desperate need to stay close to him. At the hospital, they whisked him away immediately, leaving me stranded in the waiting room with forms I could barely focus on. My hands still trembled as I filled in the familiar details. Name, DeShawn Marcus Taylor. Date of birth, June 14th, 1987. Address, 2847 Oakwood Drive. Insurance provider, emergency contact. I knew all of this by heart. These were the facts of my husband's life, the basic information that defined him on paper. I signed my name at the bottom, Simone Michelle Taylor, and handed the clipboard back to the receptionist, who barely glanced at it before filing it away. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. I sat in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs, my body rigid with tension, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios. A brain aneurysm, a stroke, a tumor. Each possibility felt more terrifying than the last. I thought about calling his mother, but I didn't want to alarm her until I knew more. I thought about calling my own mother, but she would just tell me to pray. And while I believed in the power of prayer, I needed something more concrete right now. I needed information. I needed someone to tell me that my husband was going to be okay. An hour passed, then another. I watched other families come and go, some leaving with relieved smiles, others with tissues pressed to their eyes. I couldn't tell which category I would fall into. Every time a doctor emerged from the double doors leading to the emergency department, my heart would leap, only to sink again when they called someone else's name. I was alone in my vigil, and the isolation felt crushing. Finally, a doctor appeared, a tall woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. She scanned the waiting room, her gaze settling on me. I stood immediately, my legs unsteady beneath me. "Are you here for Marcus DeShawn Henderson?" she asked. I stared at her, confused. "I'm sorry, who?" The doctor glanced down at her tablet, then back up at me. "Marcus DeShawn Henderson. He was brought in this morning with a head injury." "I think there's been a mistake," I said, my voice tight. "My husband is DeShawn Taylor. DeShawn Marcus Taylor. He's the one who fell in our bathroom." The doctor's expression shifted, a flicker of something, confusion perhaps, or concern, crossing her features. "Can you describe your husband for me?" "He's 6'1", athletic build, has a scar on his left eyebrow from when he was a kid. He was wearing gray pajama pants and a white t-shirt." My voice grew more frantic with each detail. "He hit his head on the bathtub. There was so much blood." "That matches our patient," the doctor said slowly. "But according to his identification, his name is Marcus DeShawn Henderson." The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. "That's impossible. I've been married to him for 7 years. His name is DeShawn Taylor." The doctor's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing genuine concern. "Ma'am, I think we need to sit down and talk. Would you come with me?" I followed her through the double doors, my mind reeling. This had to be some kind of administrative error. Maybe they'd mixed up his file with another patient's. Maybe the paramedics had grabbed the wrong wallet. There was a rational explanation for this. There had to be. She led me to a small consultation room, the kind reserved for delivering bad news. The walls were painted a soft blue, probably meant to be calming, but the color only made me feel colder. She gestured for me to sit, and I did, perching on the edge of the chair, my entire body coiled tight. "Your husband is stable for now," she began, and I felt a rush of relief so powerful it nearly made me dizzy. "He has a subdural hematoma which is bleeding in the brain. We're monitoring him closely, and we may need to perform surgery to relieve the pressure, but he's holding steady at the moment." "Can I see him?" "In a moment. But first, I need to understand this name discrepancy. When we checked his wallet, we found a driver's license, credit cards, and an insurance card, all in the name Marcus DeShawn Henderson. We also found a second driver's license in the name DeShawn Marcus Taylor, but it appears to be a fake." My breath caught in my throat. "What do you mean, a fake?" "The hologram is wrong. The material is slightly off. It's a good forgery, but it's definitely not legitimate." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Mrs. Taylor, is it possible that your husband has been living under an assumed identity?" The question hung in the air between us, absurd and impossible, and yet somehow terrifyingly plausible. I thought about how little I actually knew about DeShawn's past. He'd told me he grew up in foster care, that he didn't have much contact with his family, that he'd worked hard to build himself up from nothing. I'd admired his resilience, his ability to create a successful life despite a difficult start. But now those gaps in his history, the ones I'd filled in with understanding and compassion, suddenly seemed like chasms, hiding secrets I couldn't begin to fathom. "I don't understand," I whispered. "Why would he do that?" "I can't answer that, but I think you should contact the police. And in the meantime, would you like to see him? Maybe when he wakes up, he can explain." I nodded mutely, and she led me down a corridor to the intensive care unit. The steady beep of monitors filled the air, a rhythm that should have been comforting but instead felt ominous. She stopped at a room with glass walls, and there he was, my husband, lying pale and still in the hospital bed, tubes running from his arms, a bandage wrapped around his head. He looked vulnerable and small, nothing like the confident man who kissed me goodbye every morning. I moved to his bedside, taking his hand in mine. His skin was cool to the touch. "DeShawn," I murmured, and then, testing the foreign syllables, "Marcus?" He didn't respond. His eyes remained closed, his breathing regulated by the oxygen mask over his face. The doctor touched my shoulder gently. "I'll give you some privacy. If there's any change, the nurses will let me know." After she left, I sank into the chair beside his bed, still holding his hand, staring at this man I thought I knew. 7 years. 7 years of waking up beside him, of sharing meals and conversations and dreams. 7 years of building a life together. And now I was being told that even his name was a lie. I studied his face, looking for clues I might have missed. The scar on his eyebrow that he said came from a childhood accident. The slight crook in his nose that he claimed was from a high school basketball game. Were those stories true? Was anything true? My phone buzzed in my pocket. I'd forgotten I even had it with me. I pulled it out and saw a text from my principal, asking if I was okay, if I'd be in today. I realized I hadn't called in, hadn't told anyone what was happening. I typed out a quick response, saying there was a family emergency and I wouldn't be in for the rest of the week, possibly longer. As I set the phone down, I noticed DeShawn's belongings in a clear plastic bag on the counter. His wallet, his keys, his phone. I hesitated for only a moment before reaching for the bag. If he was going to lie to me for 7 years, he'd forfeited his right to privacy. His phone was locked, but I knew his passcode. He'd never hidden it from me, or at least, I thought he hadn't hidden anything from me. I entered the 6 digits, our anniversary, and the screen unlocked. My hands shook as I opened his messages, not knowing what I was looking for, but certain I would know it when I found it. Most of the texts were mundane, conversations with coworkers about projects and deadlines, a group chat with some guys I recognized from the gym, messages from me asking him to pick up milk or reminding him about dinner plans. Normal, boring, the digital detritus of an ordinary life. But then I found a thread with no name attached, just a phone number. The messages were sparse, cryptic. "Everything still secure?" the unknown number had asked 3 weeks ago. "Yes, no problems," DeShawn had replied. "Good. Keep it that way." I scrolled further back, finding similar exchanges scattered over months. Nothing explicit, nothing that definitively proved anything, but the tone was wrong. These weren't the messages of friends or colleagues. There was something transactional about them, something cold. I moved to his email next, searching through his inbox. Again, mostly work correspondence, newsletters he never read, confirmations for online purchases, but buried in a folder labeled Archive. I found something that made my blood run cold. An email from 4 months ago with the subject line, "Final payment received." I opened it, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. "Funds confirmed. Your obligation is fulfilled. Remember our agreement. No contact after this." It was signed only with the initial K. What obligation? What agreement? I felt like I was trying to assemble a puzzle with half the pieces missing, and the image forming was one I didn't want to see. I set the phone down and returned to the wallet, removing his driver's license, the one the doctor said was fake. I held it up to the light, examining it. To my untrained eye, it looked completely legitimate. DeShawn Marcus Taylor, with our address, with his photo. But apparently it was a forgery, which meant the other one, the one for Marcus Javon Henderson, was real. I pulled out that license as well, comparing them side by side. The photos were clearly the same man, my husband, but the details were different. According to this license, Marcus Henderson lived at an address I didn't recognize, in a town I'd never heard of. His date of birth was different too, off by almost 2 years. Who was this man? And who was the woman who had married him, who had shared his bed and his life, without ever knowing his real name? I thought about our wedding, how small it had been. DeShawn had told me he didn't have family to invite, and I'd felt sorry for him, had tried to make sure he felt surrounded by love despite that absence. My family had welcomed him with open arms, my mother treating him like the son she'd never had. Had they all been deceived too? Or was I the only one foolish enough not to see through the lies? The nurse came in to check his vitals, interrupting my spiral of thoughts. She smiled at me kindly. "How are you holding up?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I honestly don't know." "He's a fighter," she said, adjusting one of the monitors. "The doctor said his scans are looking better. There's a good chance he'll wake up soon." Wake up to what? I wanted to ask. Wake up to face the questions I needed answers to? Wake up to the collapse of everything we'd built together? Instead, I just nodded and thanked her. After she left, I sat in the heavy silence, listening to the machines that were keeping my husband alive, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for him to wake up and explain. I was going to find out the truth myself. Whatever it took, however deep I had to dig, I was going to uncover who Marcus Javon Henderson really was and why he had felt the need to become DeShawn Marcus Taylor. I kissed his forehead gently, a gesture of habit more than affection, and left the hospital room. In the hallway, I pulled out my phone and did something I never thought I'd do. I called a private investigator. The firm I found online had good reviews and promised discretion. A woman answered, her voice professional and warm. I explained my situation as briefly as possible, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to sound like I was losing my mind. I need you to find out everything you can about someone named Marcus Javon Henderson, I said. And I need you to tell me why he's been pretending to be someone else. She took down the information I had, the address from his driver's license, his date of birth, anything that might help. She told me she'd start immediately and would call me as soon as she found anything significant. Mrs. Taylor, she said before we hung up, I have to ask, are you prepared for what you might find? Sometimes the truth is harder to live with than the lie. I looked back through the glass at the man in the hospital bed, tubes and wires connecting him to machines, his face peaceful in unconsciousness. I don't think I have a choice, I said. I spent that first night in the hospital, dozing fitfully in the chair beside his bed. Every time a nurse came in, I would jolt awake, hoping for news that he was regaining consciousness. But he remained still, locked in whatever darkness the injury had placed him in. By morning, I was exhausted, my body aching from the uncomfortable chair, my mind foggy from lack of real sleep. A different doctor came by, younger than the woman from yesterday, with a kind but serious expression. We're going to need to operate, he said after examining the latest scans. The bleeding hasn't stopped on its own, and if we don't intervene, there could be permanent brain damage. I signed the consent forms with shaking hands, my signature, Simone Michelle Taylor, next to his name, Marcus Javon Henderson. The juxtaposition felt surreal, like I was signing away the life of a stranger. They wheeled him away to surgery, and I was left alone again, this time in a different waiting room, one filled with other families facing their own crises. I tried to read a magazine I found on a side table, but the words blurred together, meaningless. All I could think about was what might be happening in that operating room, what they might find when they opened up his skull, what secrets might be hidden even in the tissue of his brain. My phone rang, the private investigator. Mrs. Taylor, I found some preliminary information, she said. Are you somewhere you can talk? I stepped out into the hallway, finding a quiet corner. Yes, tell me. Marcus Javon Henderson has a criminal record. He was arrested 8 years ago for identity theft and fraud. He served 2 years in prison and was released on parole. The address on his driver's license is his last known residence before he disappeared. My knees went weak. I leaned against the wall for support. Identity theft? Yes. He was part of a larger operation that created fake identities and sold them. He was apparently one of the forgers. Very talented from what the reports say. He could make documents that were nearly impossible to detect as fake. So, DeShawn Taylor is just another fake identity he created? It appears that way. But here's where it gets interesting. I haven't been able to find any record of a DeShawn Marcus Taylor before 7 years ago. No birth certificate, no school records, nothing. It's like he materialized out of thin air right around the time you met him. I closed my eyes, fighting back the wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm me. What else? I'm still digging, but there's something else you should know. 2 months after Marcus Henderson was released from prison, a man named Terrence Jameson was murdered. Jameson was the leader of the identity theft ring that Marcus was part of. The case was never solved. The implication hung in the air between us, heavy and terrible. You think my husband killed someone? My voice came out as a whisper. I'm not saying that, but the timing is suspicious, and if Marcus went into hiding, created a completely new identity, it would make sense that he was running from something, or someone. I thanked her and asked her to keep digging, to find out everything she could. After I hung up, I stood in that hallway for a long time, trying to process what I'd just learned. My husband was a convicted criminal. He might be a murderer, and the man I'd loved for 7 years had never really existed at all. The surgeon found me there an hour later. The operation had been successful, he said. They'd relieved the pressure on his brain, stopped the bleeding. Now it was just a matter of waiting for him to wake up. When will that be? I asked. Could be hours, could be days. Every brain injury is different. But his vitals are strong. I'm optimistic. I returned to his room in the ICU, to the chair that was becoming too familiar. He looked the same as before, except now there was a fresh bandage wrapped around his head, larger than the previous one. I took his hand again, studying his fingers, the way they laced with mine. I'd held this hand 1,000 times. I knew every callus, every scar, but I didn't know the man it belonged to. "Who are you?" I asked the silent room. "Really, who are you?" The second day passed much like the first. I left his side only briefly, to shower in the visitor facilities, to force down food I couldn't taste in the cafeteria, to call my principal and extend my leave, to check in with my mother and assure her that everything would be fine, even though I had no idea if that was true. The private investigator called again with more information. Marcus Henderson had grown up in the foster system, just like DeShawn had claimed. That part, at least, was true. He'd aged out of care at 18 and had struggled to find legitimate work. That's when he'd fallen in with Terrence Jameson and the identity theft ring. "There's something else," she said. "I found a connection to your city. One of the identities that Marcus helped create was for a man who used it to flee to Birmingham. It's possible that when Marcus got out of prison and needed to disappear, he came here because he was familiar with the area. So I was just convenient?" I asked bitterly. "Just part of his cover? I can't speak to his motivations for marrying you. But yes, choosing Birmingham makes sense from a practical standpoint." After that call, I sat with my anger, letting it burn through the shock and confusion. He had used me. Our entire relationship had been built on a foundation of lies. Every moment we'd shared, every intimacy, every promise, it had all been part of his elaborate deception. But even as I raged, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered doubts. I thought about the way he looked at me sometimes, like I was something precious and unexpected. I thought about the time I'd had the flu, and he'd stayed home from work for 3 days to take care of me, bringing me soup and changing my fever-soaked sheets without complaint. I thought about the night he'd cried in my arms after we'd watched a documentary about children in foster care, and he'd told me he wanted to be a better man than the system had expected him to be. Had all of that been performance? Or was it possible that even a man living a lie could still feel genuine emotion? On the third day, he woke up. I was half asleep in the chair when I heard him groan. My eyes snapped open, and I saw his head turning slightly, his eyelids fluttering. I pressed the call button for the nurse and leaned over him. "DeShawn, can you hear me?" His eyes opened, unfocused at first, then gradually finding my face. He tried to speak, but the oxygen mask muffled his words. The nurse arrived and removed it, replacing it with a nasal cannula. "Simone," he croaked, his voice rough from disuse. "What happened?" "You fell. You hit your head. You've been unconscious for 3 days. He lifted his hand, fingers fumbling toward the bandage on his head. 3 days? "Yes." I took a breath, steeling myself. "The doctors have been taking good care of you. Marcus." His hand froze. His eyes met mine, and in that moment, I saw everything: the recognition, the fear, the knowledge that his carefully constructed world had just collapsed. "Simone, I can explain," he began. "Can you?" I stood up, crossing my arms over my chest. "Can you explain why you've been lying to me for 7 years? Can you explain why my husband's name isn't actually his name? Can you explain the criminal record? The murdered man? Can you explain any of it?" He closed his eyes and a single tear tracked down his cheek. "I wanted to tell you. So many times I wanted to tell you. But you didn't. You married me under a false identity. You let me build my entire life around a man who doesn't exist." "I exist," he said quietly. "Simone, I exist. I'm right here." "No, DeShawn Taylor exists. I don't know who you are." The nurse, who had been standing awkwardly by the door, cleared her throat. "I'm sorry, but I need to examine him and update the doctor. Maybe you could step outside for a few minutes?" I left the room gratefully. my hands shaking with a volatile mixture of relief that he was awake and fury at what his awakening meant. I walked to the end of the hallway, looking out a window at the parking lot below, at the ordinary world continuing its ordinary business while mine fell apart. My phone rang again, the private investigator. "Mrs. Taylor, I found something important. I think you need to hear this before you talk to your husband again." "What is it?" "The murder of Terrence Jameson. The police file indicates there was a witness, someone who came forward anonymously. That witness described the shooter as a woman named Keisha Morrison, who was Jameson's girlfriend and partner in the identity theft operation." I frowned. "I don't understand. What does this have to do with Marcus?" "After the murder, Keisha disappeared. But before she did, she emptied out several of the gang's bank accounts. Over $1 million just gone. The police have been looking for her for 8 years." "So Marcus didn't kill Jameson?" "It doesn't appear so. But here's the thing. I did some more digging into Marcus's background. I found something buried in the prison records. Marcus had a girlfriend while he was inside, someone he wrote letters to. Her name was Simone." My heart stopped. "What?" "Not you, obviously. This was before you met. But I found the letters, Mrs. Taylor. He wrote about her constantly, how she was the only person who'd ever believed in him, how he was going to make a life with her when he got out, how he was going to leave his old life behind and become someone better for her." "What happened to her?" "She died. Car accident 2 weeks before he was released from prison. The letters stop after that." I leaned against the wall, my mind reeling. He'd had another Simone, a first Simone. And when he lost her, he'd created a new identity and found me. "Mrs. Taylor, are you still there?" "Yes, I'm here. There's one more thing. The last letter he wrote, the one after he learned about her death, it's heartbreaking. He talks about how he doesn't deserve happiness, how everyone he cares about gets hurt. He says he's going to disappear, become someone new, someone who can't hurt people anymore. And then he writes, 'But maybe someday I'll find another Simone, and maybe this time I'll be good enough to keep her safe.'" I ended the call and stood there, processing this new information. He hadn't just given me a dead woman's name. He'd been trying to resurrect something he'd lost, trying to have a second chance at the life that had been stolen from him. It didn't excuse the lies. It didn't make what he'd done right. But it added a layer of tragedy to the betrayal that I hadn't expected. I returned to his room. The nurse had finished her examination and left us alone again. He was sitting up slightly now, looking more alert but also more miserable than I'd ever seen him. "Her name was Simone, too," I said without preamble. "The woman you loved before me." He closed his eyes again. "You know everything, then." "Not everything, but enough. Enough to know that you're Marcus Henderson, a convicted felon who's been living under a fake identity. Enough to know that you named me after a dead woman. Enough to know that our entire marriage is built on lies." "I didn't name you after her," he said quietly. "When I met you, when you told me your name was Simone, I thought it was a sign, like the universe was giving me another chance. I know how crazy that sounds. What's crazy is that you thought you could build a real life on a foundation of lies. What's crazy is that you thought I wouldn't find out. I don't know. I tried not to think that far ahead. I was just trying to hold on to what we had for as long as I could." I stood up and paced the small room, my emotions churning. Part of me wanted to walk out and never look back. But part of me, the part that had loved DeShawn or Marcus or whoever he was, that part was breaking at the thought of leaving him. "The police are going to find out," I said finally. "The hospital reported the ID discrepancy. There are going to be questions. I know, I'm prepared to face that. You could go back to prison, violating parole, using a false identity, probably a dozen other charges." "I know," he said again. His acceptance was infuriating and heartbreaking in equal measure. "And what about us? What about our marriage? Is it even legal if you married me under a false name?" "Probably not. I don't know. I never looked into it because I didn't want to know." I stopped pacing and looked at him, really looked at him. Under the bandages and the pallor of illness, he was still the man I'd woken up beside for 7 years. His eyes were the same eyes that had looked at me with love every morning. His hands were the same hands that had held mine through my grandmother's funeral, through the stress of standardized testing season, through 1,000 ordinary moments that made up a life together. But he was also a stranger, a man with a criminal past and a made-up present, a man who had lied to me about the most fundamental thing, his own identity. "I don't know if I can forgive this," I whispered. "I don't expect you to. I just hope you can understand why I did it, even if you can't forgive it." A knock at the door interrupted us. A police officer stood in the hallway, and my heart sank. This was it, the moment when the consequences of his choices would come crashing down. "Marcus Javon Henderson?" the officer asked, looking at my husband. "Yes," he answered, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "I need to ask you some questions about your current identity and residency." I stepped back, giving them space, watching as the officer pulled out a notepad and began the formal process of unraveling the life we'd built together. My husband answered each question honestly, no longer trying to hide behind the facade of DeShawn Taylor. There was something almost relieving in his honesty now, as if a weight had been lifted, even as the walls closed in. The officer took notes, asked about his parole status, about how he'd obtained the false identity. My husband explained it all, calm and matter of fact, accepting responsibility for his actions. When the officer asked if he was involved in any current criminal activity, he said no with such conviction that I almost believed him. "I'm going to need you to come down to the station once you're medically cleared," the officer said finally. "There will be charges filed. You should get a lawyer." After the officer left, I collapsed back into the chair, emotionally exhausted. What happens now? Now I face what I've been running from for 8 years. I'll probably go back to prison for violating parole, maybe longer, depending on what else they charge me with. And me? He looked at me with such sorrow it physically hurt. "You get to decide what you want to do. If you want to file for divorce, I won't fight it. If you want to pretend you never knew, that you were deceived, I'll back up that story. Whatever you need to protect yourself, I'll do it. What I need is for the last 7 years to have been real. What I need is for my husband to actually be who I thought he was. But I can't have that, can I?" "No," he admitted. "You can't. And I'm so sorry for that. More sorry than I know how to express." I left the hospital that evening, needing space to think, to process everything that had happened. I drove home to our house, the one we'd bought together 3 years ago, the one we'd painted and furnished and filled with plans for the future. Walking through the door felt like entering a museum of a life that no longer existed. I went to his office, the room he used when he brought work home. I'd rarely been in here, respecting his space, trusting that he needed privacy for his work. Now I went through everything with desperate thoroughness. His files, his drawers, his computer. Most of it was exactly what it appeared to be. Work documents from his job at the financial consulting firm. That job, at least, was real. He'd earned it through legitimate skills, even if the identity he'd used to apply for it was fake. There were no hidden stashes of cash, no weapons, no evidence of current criminal activity, just the ordinary paperwork of an ordinary life. But in the back of his closet, hidden behind a loose board, I found a small fireproof box. It was locked, but I knew where he kept the key, on a hook inside his desk drawer marked MISC. I opened the box with shaking hands. Inside were documents I'd never seen before. His real birth certificate, Marcus Javon Henderson, born in a hospital in a city I'd never visited, his prison release papers, and letters, dozens of letters, tied together with a ribbon. I untied the ribbon and began to read. They were from the first Simone, written to him during his incarceration. Her handwriting was neat and feminine, and her words were full of hope and encouragement. She told him about her day, her classes, her dreams of helping people. She told him she believed in him, that she knew he could change, and his responses, which were also in the box, carbon copies he'd kept. He wrote about his regret, his determination to be better. He wrote about the future they would build together. He wrote with a vulnerability and honesty that made my heart ache. The last letter was from her sister, the one informing him of her death. It was brief and cold, as if the sister blamed him somehow for what had happened. She was driving to the prison to visit you when the accident happened, the sister had written. She was so excited to see you. Maybe if she hadn't been thinking about you, she would have seen the truck. I set the letters down, crying for the first time since this nightmare began. I cried for the first Simone, whose life had been cut short before she could save the man she loved. I cried for Marcus, who had lost her and then tried to recreate what they had with me. And I cried for myself, for the betrayal and the confusion, and the terrible knowledge that despite everything, I still loved him. The doorbell rang, startling me. I wiped my eyes and went to answer it, finding my mother on the doorstep with a casserole dish and a worried expression. "Simone, baby, I've been so worried. You haven't been returning my calls. How is DeShawn?" I stepped aside to let her in, and as she bustled into the kitchen, chattering about how I needed to keep my strength up, about how the church was praying for us, I realized I had to tell her. I had to tell someone. "Mama," I said, interrupting her, "we need to talk. It's about DeShawn. He's not who we thought he was." I told her everything while we sat at the kitchen table, her casserole forgotten. I watched her face cycle through disbelief, shock, anger, and finally a kind of resigned sadness. "Oh, baby," she said when I finished. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know. I'm so angry, Mama. He lied to me about everything. But I also keep thinking about why he did it, about the first Simone and how he lost her. And I wonder if maybe some people deserve a second chance." "Some people do," she said carefully. "But that doesn't mean you have to be the one to give it to him. You've been hurt. Your trust has been broken. It's okay to walk away." "But what if I still love him? What if underneath all the lies, the man I fell in love with is real?" "Then you have a very difficult decision to make. And whatever you decide, I'll support you." "But Simone, you need to be honest with yourself about what you can live with. Can you live with being married to a man who's going to prison? Can you live with the stigma, with the questions, with never being quite sure if he's telling you the whole truth?" Those questions haunted me through the night and into the next day. I went back to the hospital, finding him awake and alert, the color returning to his face. The doctor said he was recovering well, that he'd probably be discharged in a day or two, at which point he'd be transferred to police custody. "We don't have much time," I said, sitting down beside him. "Before you're arrested and all this becomes even more complicated than it already is, I need you to answer something for me, completely honestly." "Anything," he said. "Did you ever love me? Or was I just a convenient replacement for the woman you lost?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I braced myself for whatever truth was coming. "When I first saw you, when you told me your name, yes, part of what drew me to you was the echo of her. I won't lie about that. But Simone, the woman you are, you're nothing like her. She was gentle and patient and kind, but she was also sad. She carried so much sadness from the things she'd seen, the people she tried to help. You're different. You're fierce and stubborn, and you laugh so loudly in movie theaters that people turn around to look at you. You're terrible at cooking breakfast, but somehow make the best lasagna I've ever had. You cry during commercials about dogs, and you argue with political commentators on TV like they can hear you. Despite everything, I felt a smile tugging at my lips. I fell in love with you, he continued. Not with the idea of you, not with the memory of someone else, but with you, Simone Michel, who taught 4th grade and volunteered at the animal shelter and had strong opinions about which grocery store had the best produce. You became the most real thing in my life, even when everything else about me was fake. And that's the tragedy of this, that the one true thing I had, I built on a foundation of lies. "I want to believe you," I whispered. "I know you probably can't. I've given you every reason not to, but it's the truth. Maybe the first completely honest thing I've said since I met you." Over the next 2 days, we talked more than we ever had in our marriage. He told me everything about his past. No detail too small, no story too painful to share. I learned about his childhood, the homes he'd been placed in, the people who had failed him. I learned about his crimes, the specific documents he'd forged, the people he'd helped disappear. I learned about his time in prison, the violence and the fear and the slow process of education that had given him marketable skills. And I told him about my own pain, the betrayal I felt, the way his lies had made me question everything I thought I knew about my own judgment. I told him how it felt to realize that even my own name carried the weight of his past, that I'd been living in the shadow of a dead woman without knowing it. "I can never make this right," he said, on what would be his last day in the hospital before his transfer to police custody. "I know that, but if you give me the chance, even just the chance to try, I will spend the rest of my life proving to you that my love was real." That night, I went home and made the hardest decision of my life. I called a lawyer, a good one, and asked him to represent my husband. I explained the situation, the identity theft, the parole violation, all of it. The lawyer was honest with me. "He's going to do time," he said, "but given that he's been living a clean life for 8 years, that he has steady employment and community ties, we might be able to argue for leniency. Maybe 2 to 3 years instead of the full 10 he could face for parole violation alone." "Can you take the case?" "I can, but Mrs. Taylor, I have to ask, are you sure you want to do this? You could walk away right now, get an annulment, claim you were deceived, which you were. Start fresh." "I know, but I'm not ready to give up on him, not yet." The next morning, I was at the hospital when they came to transport him to the county jail. He was handcuffed, dressed in the clothes I'd brought from home, looking both vulnerable and resigned. "I hired you a lawyer," I told him, "one of the best in the state." His eyes widened. "Simone, you can't afford that." "I can, and I did. He thinks he can work out a plea deal, maybe get you a reduced sentence." "Why would you do that?" I took his cuffed hands in mine, looking into his eyes. "Because despite everything, I still love you. I'm furious with you. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully trust you again. But I love you. And I believe people deserve second chances. Maybe even third chances." He started to cry, and I'd never seen him cry before, not like this. "I don't deserve you." "No, you probably don't. But we don't always get what we deserve. Sometimes we get what we need. And I think maybe we need each other." As they led him away, he looked back at me one last time. "I will make this right," he called out. "I swear to you, I will spend the rest of my life making this right." And I believed him. Maybe I was a fool. Maybe I was making the biggest mistake of my life. But as I watched him disappear through the doors, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt since this nightmare began. The trial was surprisingly quick. With a good lawyer and his cooperation with the authorities, they worked out a plea deal. 3 years in medium security for the parole violation and the false identity charges. It was more than I'd hoped, but less than it could have been. On the day of his sentencing, I sat in the courtroom, my mother beside me, her hand gripping mine. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, Marcus stood up. "Your Honor, I want to take full responsibility for my actions. I violated my parole. I created a false identity. I lived a lie for 8 years. There's no excuse for what I did, but I want to explain why I did it. I was trying to escape my past, to become someone better. I know that's not how it works, that you can't outrun who you were by pretending to be someone else. I hurt people with my deception, most of all my wife, who had no idea she was marrying a convicted felon." He turned to look at me. "Simone, I know I've broken your trust. I know I've made your life infinitely more complicated. But I want you to know that every day we spent together was real for me. My love for you is the most honest thing I've ever felt, and if you're willing to wait for me, I will spend the rest of our lives proving that to you." The judge sentenced him to 3 years, with the possibility of parole after 18 months for good behavior. As they led him away, he mouthed, "I love you," to me, and I mouthed it back. That was 6 months ago. I visit him every week, sometimes more often when my teaching schedule allows. We talk on the phone nearly every day. He's taking classes inside, working toward a degree in business management. He started a program mentoring younger inmates, trying to steer them away from the mistakes he made. And slowly, painfully, we're rebuilding trust. It's not easy. There are days when I'm so angry I can barely speak to him. There are nights when I lie awake, wondering if I'm making a terrible mistake. But there are also moments when we talk and laugh like we used to, when I see glimpses of the man I fell in love with, and I remember why I'm doing this. My friends think I'm crazy. Most of them have told me I should divorce him, move on, find someone who hasn't lied about his entire identity. My mother supports me but worries constantly. My colleagues at school don't know the full story. I've just told them my husband is serving time for a nonviolent offense related to something that happened before we met. But I know something they don't. I know what it's like to make mistakes and wish desperately for another chance. I know what it's like to carry shame and fear and the weight of a past you can't change. And I know that sometimes the people who've fallen the furthest are the ones who work the hardest to climb back up. Last week, I found out I'm pregnant. I haven't told him yet. I want to do it in person during my next visit. I'm terrified and excited in equal measure. This wasn't how I imagined becoming a mother, with my husband in prison and our future so uncertain. But maybe this baby is exactly what we need. A reason to keep fighting, to keep believing in second chances. I've started going through our house, slowly changing things. I took down the pictures of DeShawn Taylor and replaced them with new photos from our prison visits, photos where he's labeled by his real name. I'm learning to love Marcus Henderson, to see him as a complete person, past and present, mistakes and growth. The other day, I was going through some old boxes and I found our wedding album. I sat on the floor of our bedroom, looking through the pictures, seeing myself so happy and naive, seeing him looking at me with such love and such fear that I wondered how I'd never noticed it before. There was one photo in particular that made me stop. It was taken during our first dance, and the photographer had captured us mid-spin. I was laughing, my head thrown back, my dress swirling around us, and he was looking at me with an expression of such wonder and terror, like he couldn't believe his luck, but was just waiting for it to run out. I understood that look now. He'd been living on borrowed time, building a life on a foundation he knew could crumble at any moment. Every day with me had been both a gift and a lie, joy and guilt intertwined so tightly he couldn't separate them. I closed the album and made a decision. When he gets out, we're going to renew our vows, not as DeShawn and Simone, but as Marcus and Simone. We're going to stand in front of our friends and family, everyone knowing the truth this time, and we're going to make real promises based on who we actually are, not who we pretended to be. It won't be easy. We have a long road ahead of us. But I think about that first Simone sometimes, the one who believed in him when he was at his lowest, who saw potential in him that no one else did. She didn't get her second chance with him, but maybe in some strange way, I'm carrying on what she started. Maybe loving someone means seeing not just who they are or who they were, but who they're trying to become. Tomorrow I'll go visit him again. I'll sit across from him in the visiting room, separated by a table and watched by guards, and I'll tell him about our baby. I'll watch his face light up with joy and fear, and then I'll take his hands, and I'll promise him what I've promised him every week since he was sentenced. I'll promise to wait, to believe, to give him the second chance he's fighting so hard to deserve. Because that's what love is, isn't it? Not just loving someone when they're perfect, but choosing to love them when they're broken, when they've made terrible mistakes, when the easiest thing would be to walk away. My husband's name is Marcus Javon Henderson. He's a convicted felon serving time for parole violation and identity fraud. He lied to me about who he was for 7 years. He built our entire relationship on a foundation of deception, and I love him anyway. Maybe that makes me a fool. Maybe I'll regret this decision someday. But right now, sitting in our home, my hand on my still flat belly where our child is growing, I feel something I haven't felt in months. I feel hope. The future is uncertain. I don't know what will happen when he gets out, whether we'll be able to make this work, whether the trust we're rebuilding will be strong enough to last. I don't know how I'll explain all this to our child someday, how I'll tell them that their father had to become someone else before he could become himself. But I know this. We get to try. Despite everything, despite the lies and the betrayal and the broken promises, we get another chance. And maybe that's all anyone can ask for. So yes, my husband lay dying on the operating table, and the name the doctors called him by wasn't the name I knew. But in that moment of crisis, in that brush with death, the lies finally fell away. And what we're left with now is harder and messier and more complicated than what we had before. But it's real. For the first time in our relationship, it's completely, painfully, beautifully real. And that has to count for something. So please tell me what you thought of the story in the comments below. And if you like this tale, please subscribe to the channel. It helps me to keep creating these wonderful stories. Until tomorrow, all my love.